Our next speaker, and I'm very excited to see this one, is Dr. Emmanuel Van Westergen. She is a national veterinarian out of France, did her PhD. She's veterinary faculty. It used to be at University of Liège, and that's like the big veterinary school in Belgium. And I lived in Belgium for a while, and you always hear about Dr. Emmanuel Westergren as being somebody who's doing cutting edge research, and she really has. She's done a very, very good job, and we really respect her. I hear she's actually in Florida right now, which is kind of impressive. You're in the warm climate. A constant in sports medicine. She has a veterinary practice in Belgium, and she also helps with the Veterinary Equine Practice Society and the French Association of Equine Practitioners, and she was the team veterinarian in 2015 for the the Belgian team. Yeah, I didn't mean to say that, Emmanuel. I said Belgium. Hold on. Doc Well for helping us today, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, Doc, you're ready to go. And again, thank you very much for calling in and helping us understand this technology.
With great, great pleasure. And I'm happy because it's really, from what I followed from the beginning, everything is coming together. There's a consensus here on what we need to do to improve the welfare and health of our horses. We agree that we need to use technology because that is going to up our game and take out, some of the guessing. Here I've taken a picture of the steeplechase races in Paris and trying to figure out which horses we're going to bet on. And it's very hard, of course, even when you're an insider, to have absolute certainty of who's going to win. So I wanted to bring a little bit of a different perspective because, as some of you might know, I work in a private practice in Belgium, and we travel as an ambulatory referral practice doing sports medicine, but from the internal medicine point of view. And so everything that I've done up until now has led to try and improve my understanding of the internal functioning of the horse, and working together with veterinarians who work more on the orthopedic side of things. So if we take the parallel with racing, like motorsports, they do a lot of monitoring of their cars. They have sensors on the wheels, sensors in the cabin, sensors on the driver, etc. They test the fuel. And I think that it's a little bit what we're trying to do in horses, but I feel that sometimes the focus is very much on the chassis of the horse and the legs and the locomotion, and much less on the engine, on the fuel that you're putting in, and on the circumstances in which you race. So maybe we can start to think a little bit outside the box or a little bit more about what's going on internally. But I think that one way of monitoring these horses is to have a general overview of the biomarkers, but from the physiological standpoint. So have systems that allow us to monitor horses while they're working. And one of the technologies that's been very exciting, which has taken us out of the laboratory, out in the field, is the overground endoscope. So you can look at a horse at full speed and see exactly what's going on in his airways, which I find absolutely fascinating. But then there are other things that we can place on the horse and that are non-invasive and that can bring us more information. And that's what I do on a regular basis. I have a very large population of sport horses and show jumpers based in Europe, and they have long careers. So what we're trying to achieve is prevention so that they keep competing at a high level over the different years, which is a little bit different from racing where they have very short careers. So for us, it's doing prevention is something that we're very much used to, and maybe we can think about doing that a little bit more in race horses as well, monitoring the horses even when everything is going well. So when we are at the onset of the season, we will do exercise testing where we look at heart rate and ECG, measure lactates, have some motion analysis systems on the horse, just to have some basic information on how the horse is working and how he's coping with his work. So the idea is to have a way of evaluating the horse's workload, so we know at what level he's working, and then see what the horse's response is. Does he have normal heart rates? Is his ECG regular? How is he oxygenating himself? Blood lactates are good. And how is he moving? And these stem from what they do in humans, in human athletes. They do a lot of monitoring because, of course, it's a huge cost when you have an athlete that's injured and taken out of training. So we have means of monitoring horses during training, and we can do it at the onset of the competitive season, throughout the competitive season, and we can see if the horse is responding adequately to his training, or if we need to reduce the amount of training he's getting, or on the contrary, if we can up his game a little bit. So it's something that is really at the crossroads between what we do as veterinarians and what the trainer does as well. As vets, we're interested in monitoring health, of course, and diagnosing early on subclinical diseases that are not very expressive in their symptoms, but that will affect the horse's performance and the outcome at the competition. So it's trying to investigate how these horses function and use these systems to evaluate horses as a means to decide what we're going to do to diagnose the underlying cause of the poor performance of the horse. It's also a way of looking at horses once they've had an injury and they're rehabilitated. Is it safe enough to be able to return to training, or do we have to wait a little bit more? How does the horse respond in his body to what he's had and to how he's trained? So historically, we have systems like the polar system that allows to record speed, and that has a positioning system. It can measure heart rate as well. It calculates some parameters. And I'm sure that most of you are familiar with a lot of these systems that I've listed here in this table. The problem, I think, and something that has been a major limitation to the adoption of these technologies, is that they're not that user-friendly. I don't know if you've already seen the software interface for the polar system, but it's extremely complicated. And I think that even with a PhD, I struggle to find ways of, getting relevant data. So now that we're in the era of user-friendly technologies, maybe this technology can be used both by veterinarians and trainers, and have a common interface where the trainer has some information and the vet gets that information as well, but with the possibility of having some of the raw data and the more fundamental measurements to be able to do research and to be able to look more in depth into what has been recorded. So the technology we are using today most commonly is the Ario Neo Equimeter. And this is a system that was initially designed for trainers to be very user-friendly, easy to put on a horse, and meant to disrupt as least as possible the routine, because as you know, the morning at the yard, the race yard, things go really fast and you don't want to be fiddling with horses. They're young thoroughbreds. They're already quite spiked up when they're going to train. So you want to have something that is hassle-free. And I think that this system has proven to be really interesting in that sense. It measures also a lot of very interesting parameters, which I'll get more into depth afterwards. But all in all, I think that one of the revolutions is that it can it's easy to fit. So we have a way of measuring the microchip of the horse. And so immediately as you start the recording, the horse is already inside the system. You don't need to download the data afterwards and type the horse's name and, you know, take some of your time to fiddle with that. Everything is linked. And the data is going to be automatically uploaded to the cloud after the horse has been recorded. So we have a partnership with the Hong Kong Jockey Club, and we are able to look at the recordings of the horses from a distance. They upload the data on a cloud server, and then we can download and look at it. There is also a way of looking at the data live. I don't think that we're ready to implement that just yet. I think that the jockeys, you know, train, and the fact that they know the horse's heart rate and speed might not be that relevant. I think it's very important for the trainer to be able to look at the data, but it needs to be data that speaks to him. And so it needs to be simple and in words that they comprehend. So this is a graph showing what the Equimeter does. It is connected to the horse. It records things like heart rate, ECG, heart rate variability, the workload by looking at the speed, GPS, and the locomotion because it has three-dimensional motion sensors. All the data that is recorded is uploaded to the cloud, and the trainer gets an overview of the data once the horse has finished its training, and he can decide when he wants to look at it. He can also decide if some of the information should go to the owner and send a PDF format report to the owner so that he knows how the horse is progressing. And if he does not want to disclose that data, he's free to do so. So he decides what he wants to show or not. And then if ever something has gone wrong or the horse is a bit off, he can also allow the veterinarian to have access to that data and look more in depth into it. And then that is an open window for discussion. Do we need to interrupt that horse's training? Do we need to program for a lameness examination or for an internal medicine examination for that matter? So this is an example what the platform gives to you very simply: speed, heart rate, stride length, and stride frequency. And you have the mapping of the horse's training here with a color code for the different phases of his exercise. And you have here on the picture below an image of the system that is hooked on the horse. We have here also the overground endoscope, but it's put on the horse's girth, and it's not invasive at all. The interesting, I think that will appeal to all of you who have spoken before, all the recorded data. It's not just stride length and stride frequency. There is much more to it, of course, because you have that inertial motion sensor that yields much more information, which you can then access yourself through the platform. It is helpful, of course, for trainers to see if the horse is ready to go back to training or is fit to train. This is an example of a little 4-year-old mare who raced over 1,100 meters as a 2-year-old, but did not progress as expected as a 3-year-old. And then the trainer looked at the data, and from the recording of stride length and stride frequency, saw that this mare would fare much better cantering racing over longer distances. So they increased the distance over which she ran, and she had some good performances thereafter. So it's a very interesting tool because it speaks to the trainer and gives some information on how to adapt the horse's races. What races should you choose for that type of profile in locomotion? Of course, it's also helpful because you can follow the horse over time. You can see if the horse is progressing, and this is data on stride frequency on a horse over several months, and you can see that the horse is improving in stride frequency, and then all of a sudden there is a drop at some point, and this shows that we need to see there is a difference in the progression of the horse. This is a horse that might have an issue there. And so looking at it purely from the locomotion analysis, the stride data analysis, you can see that it is comparable, but then when you look at the recovery, heart rate recovery, the horse is recovering much more easily after the horse has had an intervention to reduce some pain. The horse was, after a veterinary examination, had some high suspensory ligament issues and was treated with shock waves. And then we could monitor her turn to training and see that she had gone back to her usual profile and she was fit to race again. This is an unfortunate picture. This is Red Cadeau, which is a horse that had a stress fracture in 2015 after almost winning the Melbourne Cup a few years beforehand. And we have had some examples of horses that were recorded and that had some either ligament or stress fracture issues. And what we saw as the most relevant data prior to this incident happening is cardiac arrhythmia. So there's not that much of a change in the overall stride length and stride frequency, at least as it is as analyzed right now with the system, which is more of a smoothed data over the total exercise and total training. But when you look more in depth, horses that have some form of pain can have cardiac arrhythmias, regardless of their cardiac health, underlying cardiac health. So we know already that looking at recovery is interesting because healthy performing horses will recover much more quickly, and horses with either locomotor issues or issues that are multiple will have an increase in their recovery rate. It's also a way of, you can look at several horses. This is a trace of the recoveries of a group of 2-year-olds. And the ones that are on the far right have longer recovery times. And all of these horses had some issues, whether they were orthopedic issues or muscular issues or cardiac or respiratory issues. So that is one of the first markers that we see as relevant to looking at the horse's health. And the idea is to be able to compare the horses between them and see if they are, consistent in their trainings within the group or if there are outliers. And then we can follow this in the same way over time and see if these horses get better or if, on the contrary, they get worse. Eventually, what we're trying to prevent is accidents during races. And we can't predict if the horse is going to go into fatal arrhythmia and full death or not right now when they're racing, because we don't have those ECGs on. But when we look at these ECGs during training, there are some indicators that these horses are not doing well and are not coping well with their work. And this is, I think, an interesting additional perspective to looking at the orthopedic issues. So once I started to work with the Ario Neo group, they offered only the heart rate, and the heart rate was nicely consistent. We validated it against the Televet system for the heart rate and heart rate variability. There are a lot less artifacts because they have some very broad patented electrodes that reduce the artifacts caused by movement. And this seemed to be, to me, interesting enough that we could maybe investigate what the Ecg trace looked like. So they extracted the ECG, and I will show you some indications afterwards, but they have a very highly consistent and very reliable signal. So you've got these two electrodes that allow you to have a single lead ECG. One is on top next to the withers and the other one is in the bottom here. They're indicated in yellow. And we validated them against the Televet system. I must say it was much less hassle because the Televet has electrodes that you need to button up to some little stickers. The stickers come off, the cables go all over the place. So here, having a single girth with everything on it is much more easy to use. Right now, they do not have a custom software to be able to look at the ECGs. So we look at tracing from the Kubios software, which is meant to look at the heart rate variability, but you can see that you have a very clean ECG tracing. And for sure, it is for us veterinarians good enough to get a clinical reading that is of high quality and that allows us to do diagnostics. So here I've put two tracings of ECGs. The one in the bottom is the one with the televet, and the one on top is the one with the Equimeter. And you can see that there is much less movement artifact and that you've got a cleaner detection here on top with the Equimeter system. This is a horse that had 2 episodes of VPCs, and he had them at peak speed. And that is an indication to look at more in depth of what's happening in this horse. Any kind of arrhythmic event can have some consequences on the horse's health, and namely the indicators post-race could be exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage, because all of a sudden you're creating a hyperpressure in your lungs due to the arrhythmia. So I wanted to share with you a few clinical examples of how we've used the system. The system is used by the trainer. We're not necessarily there on the day of the training. And so all these recordings were made by the trainer, and then we had a look at them afterwards. So that's the advantage, is that you do some pre-race screening very effectively, because they can measure a great number of horses without you having to be there and work up the horses systematically if everything is going well. On the contrary, if there's anything off, then the trainer can warn you and you can have a look at the data. So this is a 2-year-old colt. He had a promising first race, and then he showed less progress over his trainings than the other 2 2-year-olds of that racing yard. When you look at his last recording, you can see that the gray or blue tracing here is the speed, and the red trace is the heart rate. And as the speed goes down, the heart rate remains quite high up. So that is a sign that the horse has to compensate for a deficit in oxygen that is greater than it would be usually. Otherwise, that heart rate would go down parallel to that speed. So when we look at the ECG of this horse had regular SVPCs during exercise, even at maximal speeds when he was training. And that tells us that we need to look into this. This means that it could be hypoxemia that is caused by an underlying respiratory problem. It could be linked to a cardiac problem as well. A murmur was detected. This murmur had not been detected before. And it turned out on examination that this horse had mitral valve regurgitation with the beginning of dilation of his left atria. So that is not a good sign. And on the top, you have the heart rate recovery, which you can see that it increased over time. You have, of course, to look at similar training. So you have to compare the same type of exercise on the same type of track to be able to compare them. So this horse had a beginning of a cardiac issue that was incompatible with racing. This would have been a horse that would have had more episodes of supraventricular premature contractions. This would have been a horse that would have bled during exercise as well. And so this is a horse that was taken out of training, because it's no use to trying to push a horse that is, not apt to race. Second case I wanted to share with you was a 5-year-old gelding that was trained in Australia and monitored over 2 consecutive trainings. He had a very disappointing first training. He had irregular heart rates on the ECG. So when you look at his data, the speed data is here in blue on the top, and the heart rate data is in red. And they have a limit at 250, but when you look in detail at that ECG, we went up to 280 beats per minute. And on the second faster training that they did, they had to stop the horse because he was not doing well at all. So you can see that there is the exercise here, the speed goes down really progressively and the heart rate stays very, very high up. So that is typical of atrial fibrillation, which is a condition that happens in racehorses either paroxystically, that means that the horses will have it and then it will revert after 48 hours to normal rhythm. But in this case, this horse had sustained atrial fibrillation, and this condition is not compatible with performance. It is also a condition that can cause collapse in horses and in some instances, death. So if you're pushing a horse to its maximal effort, you want him to have a sound heart. This is a horse on which we need to do further investigation to see if we can cardiovert him back to a normal rhythm. If there is no underlying issues in this heart, if there are no regurgitations or no signs of myocardial damage, then we can cardiovert this horse and then monitor him when he goes back into training and detect for arrhythmias. And according to what we see, decide if the horse can continue if we can increase the intensity of his work, or on the contrary, if there are too many arrhythmias, then we decide to stay at a lower level and then see if the horse needs to be taken out of training altogether. So this is what the Ecg Trace looks like. And what we're trying to do is see, yes, there is atrial fibrillation, but are there other problems like ventricular premature contractions, which are an additional problem, which is of course incompatible with performance, but also a higher risk of having a collapse and sudden death. That was a very graphic image, and I'm sorry for showing it to you, but it's a horse that had severe bleeding and that collapsed. He did not die, but he had severe hemorrhage, and that was a horse in atrial fibrillation. So just to show you how dramatic that can be and how bad it is for the sports. And so if we can have a way of monitoring these ECGs during training without having a full-fledged veterinarian there on site, I think it is a very good way of preventing issues. And then I had this case that was very interesting to me because it was really putting all together both the internal medicine perspective and the orthopedic perspective, because that's how we need to work in a very holistic and comprehensive way. This is a 3-year-old filly that had a promising 2-year-old season, and she had to be rested because she had a tendon injury. And then she returned to work, and the trainer was pleased, but he did find that she bled from both nostril after a light canter. So we looked at the data and we've compared the data here, superimposed the trace of this mare with, that's in red, with another horse that it was perfectly sound and healthy. And you can see that there's not much difference in the speed data and the overall heart rate data, or heart rate recovery for that matter. So because of that bleeding, we look into the ECG. I'll show that right after, but this is to show you also the way that the Ario Neo system works is that you can compare horses to themselves or to other horses. So this mare in red, we compare her data to the overall data in the stables for the horses of the same age. And so her heart rate, maximal heart rate, or heart rate during trot, or heart rate during recovery. And you can see that she's above a little bit for the heart rate recovery after 15 minutes. But during maximal data, it's not that obvious. We look at her ECG, and she has got very frequent supraventricular premature contractions, and whatever the type of, whatever the phase of the exercise that she's in. So to me, as an internal medicine specialist, this could be a sign of hypoxemia. That means poor oxygen values in the horse's system. That could be caused by an airway problem. It could be caused also by primary cardiac problem, an infection, a muscular problem, overtraining, which would not be the case here because she has been rested for a long period of time, or potentially to fatigue, but there again, this is even at submaximal levels of exercise. So we did an overall run-up where we sampled the airways to see if we had an airway issue. You can see that she bled from the lungs, from those syringes that are taken from her bronchoalveolar lavage, so sampling the lungs. And looking at the lavage, we can see that, yes, indeed, she has bled. She has bled 2 episodes, which correspond to the 2 faster exercises that she did. But there is no significant inflammation of the airways there that could explain the bleeding. We did not have a cardiac murmur on auscultation, but we still did an echocardiography, which did not show any underlying cardiac issue. So this is a horse that is bleeding from the lungs without any primary cardiac or respiratory issue. And so we saw that when she was given an anti-inflammatory, and we did submaximal exercise because we did not want to push that mare, she had less frequent SVPCs. And our conclusion was that her arrhythmia was induced by pain. And that is something that is well described in humans, and we're starting to see how that fits with our equine athletes as well, is that you can have pain-induced arrhythmia in horses without any underlying primary cardiac or pulmonary issue. So here we had a horse that bled from the lungs, secondary to cardiac arrhythmia, which was initially caused by pain. We allow this mare to recover longer and allow the tendon to heal more effectively. We can keep on monitoring her during training, see that she has less and less arrhythmias, and then she can return safely back to training and to more intense training and then to racing. So with this, I just wanted to show you that we use a tool that is given to the trainers as a monitoring tool for them to follow up the training of their horses. Once they start adopting this technology, they gain for themselves some relevant information. And for us, it is a very effective communication tool between us and the trainer and the horse. So we can, even without being physically present, have a way of monitoring the horse's response to exercise and decide if the horse needs a comprehensive health check, if we need to do a lameness workup, if we need to do an internal medicine workup. We can detect abnormal patterns at work, compare the horse to himself over time, compare the horse to a group of other horses of the same level, same age. If we have any kind of question on the way that the horse is recovering or behaving during exercise, we have means of investigating more in depth its locomotion and ECG. And I think that that is going to be really, really interesting to improve and improve the horse's welfare and prevent injuries. For some of the jurisdictions where they have barrier trials, it would be very interesting to be able to fit the horses with these systems and have the jurisdiction ask that the horses be fitted with it, because then you can look and compare the data of that horse on that day to the ones of other horses and identify horses that would be at risk, and then call on the regulatory department to decide if that horse is fit to race, yes or no, or if it should have further investigation. And with that, I think I'm done with the time.